Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This is a little bit of a different kind of webinar than what you're probably used to. Generally, we're presenting educational content, information about best practices, benchmark, trends in the industry. This time, we were actually specifically asked by a lot of you if we could spend a little bit more time talking about the tools that we have to offer. Basically, the interest out there was, tell us how you get a lot of the information that you present to us on a regular basis. So with that in mind, we've put together a relatively short webinar to talk about what we call the return on physical assets, or ROPA Plus model. It is the backbone of what we call our facilities intelligence solution. So for the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking about the process that we use at about 350 institutions across the country every year to collect that information. As we go along, please feel free to interject. You can ask me questions on the fly just by typing into the box indicated there. We also always make these recordings and slides available to you on request after the event. So if you're interested in that, please let us know. What I'd like to do today is sort of start with talking about why we do what we do, for lack of a better term, talk about the challenges that are probably affecting you, and then go into how we've developed that ROPA Plus process to help you mitigate those on your campus. And hopefully, if you have any specific questions, we'll be happy to answer those as well. So jumping into why we do what we do, I want to go into a story, and the story starts in 2000 at a Eastern Regional NACUBO meeting. And when we started Sightlines, we had our instincts as to what the needs are in the marketplace, but it was best personified and explained by the exchange that we had there. We had about 80 or so business officers in a room, and we asked them a couple of interesting questions about their institutions. We started by asking them whether they knew the value of their endowments, and everybody raised their hand. We then went to ask them, did you know the return on your endowment for the last year? And everybody's hand was still up. And how about the draw rate, your spending rate on that endowment? Everybody's hand stayed up. We then asked them similar questions regarding facilities. We said, how many people off the top of your head know the replacement value of your facility? And half the hands went down. We then said, how many people in here know the draw rate on your facilities, or the deferral rate, per se, or your reinvestment rate, your backlog? And most of the hands in the room went down. And the reason why they went down was because the tools to measure and monitor physical assets were nowhere near as sophisticated as the tools that they use to measure and monitor financial assets. And the interesting thing was, typically at most institutions of higher education, the average replacement value of your facilities is 4 to 5 times that of your financial assets. So that when we talk to facilities managers across the country, we're not talking to people who are cleaning buildings or fixing heating systems or managing a group of plumbers and mechanics, even though we are. We're talking to what is essentially the largest asset manager at that institution. So the question is, do you have the resources and the metrics to effectively communicate your needs as well? And so based upon that, we set out to develop a suite of tools. The whole idea was to become an independent strategic advisor for the physical assets. And that is, give you the ability to accurately quantify your performance on facilities, to be able to separate facts from fiction. A lot of times, anecdotes rule the day when you're talking to the president or the board, and you want to make sure that you're armed with data that supports facts. and then use that to document trends, provide consistent measurement, credible benchmarking to give you the ability to make the case, not only for your historical investments, but looking forward as well. Since that time, we've been honored to work with over 450 colleges and universities. We have over 100 new members in the last two years. We work with institutions of all types, from the smallest to the largest. And when you look at a lot of the organizations in the United States, we do work with 14 of the top 20 colleges, 15 of the top 20 universities, 34 flagship state universities. But we also work across state systems and a lot of other smaller institutions that give us a really well-developed, broad database of knowledge. So that being said, I wanted to roll into some of the challenges that really go after the value and additional reasons why we do what we do. By all measures, we're coming out of a large growth period within the industry. And I want to bring up a quote that we use a lot because I think it's pretty telling. And this is a quote that essentially says, "One side effect of this rapid growth has been the creation of an increasingly large obligation for the future renewal and replacement of physical plant." We think this sounds pretty accurate, and when we talk to people, we think that it fairly accurately describes the climate on campuses today. The interesting thing is that this wasn't written even within the last year or 2 years or 3 years. This quote was written by Rick Biedenweg, who's the founder of the Pacific Partners Consulting Group, 36 years ago. And what's interesting is that Rick's writings in the article Before the Roof Caves In still ring true today. And I want to bring up some data from our institutions that really say why. And that is, when we plot all the construction ages from all the buildings in our database on a single axis, you can see that there is a large growth in space in what we call the post-war era. As it describes, it's the era after World War II. But this was fueled by the baby boom generation coming of age, the GI Bill, the space race and Sputnik fueled a lot of federal investment within higher education. And what we saw, to satisfy all those needs, quick building of a lot of space. In fact, about 40% of space that exists today on campuses is from within this era. And when Rick Biedenweg was talking about that growth, this is the era that he was referring to. These are spaces that were built between 1951 and 1975. By today's standards, they tend to be of lower construction quality, and these are the buildings that are needing repairs. Well, when Rick wrote his quote in 1980, this group of spaces was nearing its first renewal cycle. We're at about 20 years of age, 25 years of age. It's the first real cycle of interior finishes, minor mechanical upgrades, and renewals have to be done. Well, we listened to Rick, and we, as an industry, we stopped building as quickly, but then we got right back to it, and we have what we call the complex era, and those are spaces that are built in 1991 through today. They're more technically complex. We think that they are of higher quality, just because they generally contain a lot more high-tech controls and systems. They tend to be very efficient. But what's interesting today is that now these buildings are beginning to approach their 20-year renewal cycle. At the same time, those post-war facilities are nearing the 50-year line. And that's when a lot of the major systems need replacement or renewal. We're not talking about interior finishes anymore or minor life cycles. We're talking about replacement of roofs, renewal of exteriors, chillers, boilers. The big ticket items for those spaces are coming due now as well. And these two groups of spaces are essentially competing with each other for limited resources. In the 80s, you could do a lot of different things. You could borrow money, you could endowment spend, you can raise tuition, you could increase enrollment. We can't do that today, and the reason why is we have many states with declining high school graduates. The availability of external resources, including state aid on the public side, but gifts, grants, decreased. We can't really raise tuition much anymore because we've increased that over the price of inflation since 1985. And this new wave of construction just makes the risk even bigger. As a result of all that, we see backlogs up across the country. And on the public sector, when you include maintenance, modernization, and infrastructure, those backlogs are near $100. A little bit less so on the private side, but the pace of growth is still fairly similar. So the question that should force people to ask is, well, how do we prevent risk prediction from coming true? Essentially, how do we prevent the roof from caving in? And our service, ROPA Plus, was designed to do just that, and that is creating a new conversation on your campus. And our Facilities Intelligent Toolkit lets you have a conversation that does truly connect the dots between space, capital, and operations. That conversation has to treat physical plant like a core business. It should use concepts of endowment management to contextualize your decisions. It should have the goal of optimizing space resources, capital investment, and operating spending, and let you tell your story as effectively as you possibly can. So I'm going to go into a little bit more of the nuts and bolts of that now. We talked about the offering that we have is called Return on Physical Assets, or ROPA Plus. It truly is a three-phase continual improvement mechanism. Phase one is what we call discovery, collecting base data, benchmarking you across other institutions, using a vocabulary and establishing relationships between information at the institution. What we're trying to say is, what makes you tick? What have you done well? What are your opportunities? We want to learn as much as we can about that institution and teach that up the organization. Phase two is what we call prediction. We're using those metrics that we develop in order to predict future risks, help you mitigate those risks so that you can address future needs as soundly as possible. And finally, there's performance, which is creating customized measures of success and being able to monitor your progress towards those year after year. The conversation that we enable on the campus starts with a common vocabulary. Because we talk in language, the way that we talk about facilities is of key importance. The way that we describe this is developing a way to communicate from the boardroom to the boiler room. We put every metric that we compute into one of four buckets. Two of them have to do with asset value change, annual stewardship, and asset reinvestment. Annual stewardship is really defining the need to keep up with the campus on an annual basis. It's planned maintenance, it's renewal, it's cycle maintenance, it's life cycle cost. It's everything that you do to make sure that a facility or an asset reaches the end of its useful life. It's analogous to the oil changes in your car. The opposite of that, or the foil to that, is what we call asset reinvestment. And it's the opposite of keep up. It's the catch-up need. It's how much is my backlog, and what resources do I have, and what plan do I have to address that backlog. It is, when we're talking about the car, where annual stewardship is the oil change, asset reinvestment is the engine rebuild that you have to do if you don't do your oil changes. Operations success hold the other two families. The first one being operational effectiveness, and that's where we're really talking about all the nuts and bolts of the day-to-day operations of your department. Operating budget, staffing, supervision, utilities, work orders, everything that goes into providing service. And then ultimately, customer service is a suite of metrics that go into gauging the quality of space and the customer's opinion of that space. The process that we go through is a regimented process where we measure, benchmark, and analyze data at your institution, generate custom results. And then there's also a component of membership at the institution that provides you access to thought leadership, webinars like this, events, and the like. We always get the question, well, you know, there are other benchmarking offerings out there. What makes you different? You know, our core business is the strategic assessment of facilities, specifically within higher education. We don't do anything else that takes our eye off of that or produces ulterior motives. You know, we don't sell equipment, we don't provide design services, and we don't outsource operations at your institution. Another important thing is that we don't rely on surveys or self-reported data. Our professionals collect base data on site with you. We have a proprietary, what we call the Qualify, Verify, Quantify, or QVQ process, which gives us the confidence that we're basing our findings on what everybody agrees is validated, accurate data. And then finally, we get access to places at the institution that other companies don't because we have a good ability to tell the story. You know, at about half of our institutions every year, we are presenting to either a president or a board of regents or trustees. And we're able to tell a compelling story in language that non-facilities people can understand, and that's very important. A couple of benefits of membership that I mentioned. You have access to Sightlines member portal, which is the ability not only to access your own information from wherever, whenever you want, but also to run your own benchmark charts, run your own dashboards, even design your own benchmark metrics if that's what you want to do. You get the first look at our thought leadership, including our annual State of Facilities offering, which if you haven't yet read is online on our website. And you get invitations to events like the one we just had in November, a National Insights Summit, where we present a lot of our annual findings and give people like you a chance to network, interact, and develop new ways to solve a lot of the challenges that you have at your institutions. So right now what I'm going to do is kind of show you some of the examples of deliverables that often come out of the end of the process. And you know, I'm going to start with that discovery process because it really is the backbone of what we do. Question that we often get is, what data do you need at my institution? And the answer is we collect a fairly comprehensive set of indicators at your campus. We break it down into profile data, operating data, and financial data. Everything from building inventory featuring construction dates and some characteristics, deferred maintenance list, staffing table, work order reports, utility information. We also like things like institutional financial statements, operating expenditures, capital expenditures, and so on. Our goal is not to take a lot of your staff's time. So we work with you ahead of time to make sure that everybody understands our needs when we come to campus. And 9 times out of 10, the reports that you already have, the information that you already have assembled in some form or another, satisfies our needs for each of these items. Where it does not exist, we oftentimes take it upon ourselves. You know, that's our job, not yours. If it means we need to look through a box full of utility bills, well, that's what we do. If it means we have to assemble the budget from different departmental reports, that's what we do. our goal is to work with you and not to take up too much of your staff's valuable time. The first thing that we do after we collect this is figure out who's your peer group, who's your comp group. Essentially, if we're going to do a exercise with benchmarking as a component, we want to know who we need to compare you to. Well, we start with looking very simply at size of institution, program of your institution or your research university versus a liberal arts college. Where do the students oftentimes apply as well? We're looking at location because that's important. The East Coast, West Coast, and in between all have unique operating needs. But we typically go beyond that. We're looking very specifically. Are there campuses that are technically very similar to yours? A campus that's made up of lots of different high-tech laboratories, facilities, has fundamentally different facilities needs than those that are not, that are more classroom, liberal arts oriented. We look at density factor. You want to know that there's about the same mix of number of students to number of square feet. We also want to look at what we're calling grounds intensity, and that goes to scale. Am I a campus of few very large buildings versus a campus of hundreds of smaller standalone spaces? That affects maintenance, and we want to make sure that we're developing an appropriate comparative comp group when we start the exercise. So we talked about the fact that ROPA Plus helps to join concepts of space, capital, and operations. So I want to go through each of those and basically say what we collect and why. On the space side, we're collecting square footage, construction dates, renovation history, functional descriptions, utility information, etc. We're trying to look at age profile, functional profile. We're looking at density. We're looking at technical capacity. Well, why? Well, sometimes simplest measures can tell you the most about your institution. And so we're looking to answer a couple of core questions when we look at space. Is there anything that sticks out to us about just the age profile of your campus? We looked at what we call the camel hump graph earlier that says different ages of construction. Well, that affects maintenance. We want to know, how does that affect your daily service organization? We want to look at mix of space. Do campuses like you have comparable types of facilities? Do I have too much compared with others, or am I underspaced? And finally, very, very important question is, can I afford the space that I currently have? Sometimes a lack of maintenance funding and the lack of and the growth of facilities backlogs is due to schools that grew too fast. And with declining enrollments in a lot of environments, it's really important to look at that very critically. Ultimately, what's important is that we validate this and we compare it to peer institutions. Some examples. We plot every school on that same graph that we looked at before. A school that has a lot of spaces in the pre-war era is very different than a school that has a lot of newer facilities. The capital needs are different. The daily service needs are different. It tells us a lot. We're looking at risk. Very simply, we break your different facilities into different categories in terms of risk. The buildings that are over 50 years old tend to have components that are past due for renewal, and failures are possible. Those are high-risk spaces. On the other hand, low-risk spaces, buildings under 10, have little capital requirement currently and are in what we call a honeymoon period. And there are groups in between as well. We want to know, is your campus in a riskier position than others? We talked about this a little bit earlier, but the pace of student enrollment growth versus the rate of space growth. Very important. Am I growing my campus at a rate that is faster than I'm growing my student body? Or is it the opposite? And then finally, we look at things like scale. And that is, do I have lots of smaller buildings? Is there the opportunity to consolidate? Because in our experience, an appropriately scaled campus is a generally more efficient one. After space, we look at capital investments. What do we collect? We're looking at historical project spending. We're looking at deferred maintenance assessments, R&R project list, any master plans that you might have, or looking at any construction costs that you might have. And why do we do that? Well, we want to answer a lot of core questions. Perhaps the most important one is, how much should I invest each year? Once we know that, has my past investment aligned with those needs? What are the conditions like on my campus as a result of that spending? And because of my spending, am I gaining or losing ground with respect to my backlog? We spend a lot of time on figuring out what an investment target is, and there are lots of methodologies out there, and we figure out one that's most appropriate for you. There is the industry standard of 3% replacement value. You can go a little bit more fine grain and determine what a life cycle need is of renewable components. But ultimately, we recommend discounting that to account for functional obsolescence, and that is, you don't need to steward facilities that you know you are going to ultimately replace or do major renovation in. So your target should actually be lower than what we would call equilibrium. Once we determine what that goal is, the question is, well, how is my spending compared to that goal? When I look at annual stewardship spending at this institution over the last years, I'm in a zone that is under my minimum needs. What that means is that I'm increasing backlog and I'm increasing risk. Excuse me. When I look at adding capital investment over that annual stewardship, you can see that. The good news is I get closer to that range. There are years when I am in the target range, but no years where I'm really making dents and going above that yellow line and increasing my net asset value. So not only do we look at you over time, but we look at how that reinvestment rate over the years compares with institutions like you. In this case, the institution that we're talking about on the left side is underspending on average every year as compared to the peer group of institutions. But we don't really stop there. Not only is it about how much money you're spending, but it's about what you're spending it on. So we break it down by package. We're looking at breaking that down by envelope, infrastructure, building mechanicals, safety code, and space renewal. Big into balance. And we want to be sure that your capital project investment is aligned with your needs over time. We see this over and over again where maintenance studies typically call for mechanical spending or indicate that there are backlogs on the plumbing or electrical side that are critical to the performance of the building. And at the end of the day, when we look at a chart like this, most of the spending goes to space renewal. It's very important that you change the thinking, because those projects that renew space, even though they're important, are not the things that are going to prevent major failures from happening on your campus. And then ultimately, we want to show how there's a connection between annual stewardship spending and backlog at the institution. The less you keep up, the more you have to catch up. Last but not least, we look at the operations side. We are collecting things like facilities budget, staffing chart, trades, distribution, work order reporting, utility history, invoices, etc. Why? Well, we want to answer, is my budget allocated appropriately? Do I have an effective plan or preventative maintenance program? Am I efficiently staffed? Is that team supervised effectively? Are there opportunities to save money? And based on that, how well served does the community feel? Well, we have benchmarks and metrics that help us tell that story as well. We're looking at operating expenditures. We do a breakdown between daily service, just the cost of running the campus on a day-to-day basis, planned maintenance, which is more of course, planned life cycle projects, and utilities. We never rely on one benchmark to tell the story, and oftentimes when there are institutions that do that, when they focus on one metric, they oftentimes make the wrong conclusions from that metric. So everything that we do is presented in the context of several other metrics. In this case, we are looking at maintenance, and when we're telling the maintenance story, we're looking at staffing, supervision, materials, and work order output. Combined, that paints us a picture of what's happening with the maintenance function. We do the same thing for custodial, and we do the same thing for grounds as well. We are drilling down into work orders. We're not only saying how many are you doing, we're saying what type. When needed, we look at that by location. Are there particular hotspots on your campus that a simple capital project would free up hundreds of daily service hours a year? That's very important. And ultimately, all that affects utility consumption. We're benchmarking how much energy you use, and we're benchmarking how much it costs as well. We are looking at service, and it's threefold for us. We're looking at the process, we're looking at an inspection score, and we're looking at a customer survey. When we look at the process, we're looking at how are our work requests taken in, who can make requests, who schedules work, is that schedule communicated to the customer, and are customers kept aware of the status of their work. And we compare that across other institutions. The inspection score is a cursory inspection. We're really looking at the curb appeal, general repair, cleanliness, exterior condition, and mechanical spaces. We typically like to walk between 10 and 20% of the space on your campus in roughly a 3-hour tour. And then customer survey. We're looking at, are the expectations of the customer at that institution met? We're graphing that to figure out and help you pinpoint ways that you can better improve the perception of the department throughout the institution. So that gives you an overview of the process and the output of our discovery process. You know, it doesn't stop there. I mentioned we have a suite of forward-looking predictive analytics that not only, now that you know where you've been and where you are, you have to ask the question, well, where are you going? What are the things that are going to affect me for years to come? So we have a suite of predictive analytics, for example, that look at capital needs going forward. It says, what is my current backlog? What's my projected investment? And what impact does that have on my 10-year capital forecast? It lets you model the impact of those investments. If you have a capital plan, what is that going to do to what we call the net asset value, or it's almost a reverse FCI at your institution? What does that do to the risk profile that we talked about earlier? And then finally, at the end of the day, what happens with my backlog over time? Another piece of our predictive analytics is new. It's what's called the cost forecaster. Once we have all of your capital and operating information on our member website, we give you the ability to actually model the impact of changes to your campus over time. If you have plans to add a new classroom facility, cost forecaster allows you to estimate the operating requirements and the capital needs for that space going forward. You can do the same thing for demolishing or removing spaces, and you can create and save numerous different scenarios based upon your actual data that we collect at your institution. This was actually just launched in January, and we're really excited about it. We also have performance analytics that not only help you develop a plan for particular metrics, but help monitor your progress towards those objectives. Our discovery process lets you or helps you determine what future objectives are and determine areas that you want to focus on. It triangulates on best-in-class institutions. Basically, what are the institutions that do what you want to improve very well? We set objectives and target what your ultimate performance should be, and we track your performance over time. One example is, here was an institution where a focus of theirs was daily service costs. They were concerned that their day-to-day maintenance expenses were going up over time. So working with them, we really drilled down to figure out what was driving those costs, and a very simple graph was developed based upon information from the work order system. What that did was target facilities that were driving daily service needs and looking at particular capital projects in their backlog list that would reduce those risks, free up those daily service resources to do more and more planned maintenance at the institution. So to bring it all together, we just walked through a process of discovery, prediction, and performance. The culmination of all of these three is what makes up our ROPA Plus process. Ultimately, what this does is drive results at an institution. We start on top with the most accurate data about your campus, a holistic 360-degree view of finance and facilities. The analysis, insight, benchmarking, sharing of best practices brings you facilities intelligence. That enables you to make data-driven decisions on your campus, lets you make the case for better policies regarding space, capital, and operations, and ultimately enables you to continually improve the campus and align it with mission and strategy. So we're gonna stop now. I'm gonna see if there are any particular questions from the audience. Before I do that, I want to mention another webinar which is more educational. It's entitled Plan More and React Less. It's anecdotes and stories from people just like you who have built and expanded planned maintenance programs at their institution. There will be speakers on hand from Penn State and Brown University as well. So that being said, we do have a question from the audience. That question is, it seems like an intensive process. How long does it take to get going, and what is the typical timeline? Yes, it is an intensive process. We've been doing this for about 15 years, so we've become very adept at minimizing the impact at your institution. Even before we get to campus, we schedule a web-based startup meeting that lets us communicate with your team. That is, why are we here, what are we doing, and what data do we need? We're reviewing the information that we want to collect when we're on site. We're even giving them example reports that have worked for us in the past from other institutions in the hopes that maybe they have comparable output already. We then follow that up with a 2 to 3 day visit on site at the most. And in that point, we're reviewing the information that you've provided. We're collecting more if required, and we're also just asking questions that jump out at us right at the start. We then come back with what's called a qualification meeting, where we are specifically going over that information that we have now rolled up into our structures and making sure that what we collect makes sense to us and to you. There will be red flags raised on both sides. We want to walk out of there knowing that we've got validated, accurate data. Beyond that, we come back for what we call the preliminary presentation, and that is the first time where we're going to be using benchmarking and helping to tell your story. Once we agree on what that story is, that final presentation is scheduled to the audience of your choice. That is sometimes internal. It is sometimes generally above you. It goes to the CFO, the president, the board of trustees, the board of regents, whoever you feel is going to get value and whoever you think you need to tell your story to make the case. Typical timeline from beginning to end is approximately 18 weeks, depending upon the size and complexity of the institution. If the information is in good shape, we're able to schedule meetings fairly promptly on schedule. The timeline comes in a great deal. Updates of the information in years out, we do have a roughly 93% retention rate every year. So we do this over and over for all of our institutions. So we're monitoring the changes every year. Those annual updates take much less time. Great. Well, those are all of the questions that we have. I thank you for your time today. If you'd like any more information about this, the best way to reach out to us is through a very easy email address. That address is insights@sightlines.com. And we hope to be hearing from you soon. Thank you so much.